Hello and welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, a big thanks to those of you who have chosen to support this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon. That link will be in the show notes if anybody else would like to subscribe. It is so vital, so encouraging, so inspiring, and so humbling to have your support. Thank you so much. We have some incredible sponsors I'd love to tell you about. is a company that is making it possible for the wine industry to begin reusing glass bottles. Go to earth. That stands for Our Only Mission is Earth. Go to earth and let them know you've heard about them here. Also, Catavino Tours is a sponsor, and they offer luxury wine and food tours in Portugal and Spain. And you can support this podcast by checking them out and having a fantastic time on a tour with them by going to catavinotours.com/OWP. And Vermont Vineyards is a family-run business owned and operated out of small-town Vermont. They design and install vineyards of all shapes and sizes, and they aim to reduce the stigmas attached to hybrid grape varieties in New England wine regions. Check them out at vtvineyards.com/OWP, all lowercase. That's vtvineyards.com/OWP. Now, this is a winemaker's episode, and I just realized, to my satisfaction, that the vast majority of this podcast focuses on the farming of wine. Since I'm at around 10% in the cellar and 90% in the vineyard in terms of my focus, I tried to make up for lost cellar time with this episode. My guest is Clark Smith. Clark has been making and studying wine since the 1970s. He's had a huge influence on the wine world through his wine consulting business, and in 2013, he published the book Postmodern Winemaking. 10 years later, that book is still groundbreaking. Clark knows more than you do about the chemistry of winemaking. In addition to that, he'll tell you he has a bit of an ego. He may say some things that rub you the wrong way. He may say some things that you find hard to believe. He may say some things that contradict everything you know about wine. But he may also say some things that enlighten you and revolutionize your winemaking. There really isn't a way to pigeon-hole him. Clark is candid, transparent, a bit of a pot stirrer, and in pursuit of the most soulful wine he can make. In the past, he's been the whipping boy for the natural wine press, partly for his embrace of new technologies, and partly for his willingness to confront hype with science. Depending on your convictions, you can fault him or thank him for introducing reverse osmosis and microoxygenation to American winemaking. But you cannot fault him for concealing his use of techniques or technologies in his winemaking, which is more than I can say for some who claim to make natural wine. You may disagree with him, but make sure you understand him before you dismiss him. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation, including what wine really is, the googeness of wine. Minerality comes from living soil. Why Brix has nothing to do with ripeness, and how determining ripeness takes a personal relationship with a vineyard. Why watering wine back increases its aromatic and color intensity. Why he makes his best wines without sulfites, and how everything that's common knowledge about sulfites in wine is wrong. Why Brettanomyces is a hospital disease in winemaking, and why a living wine with good structure beats it. We talk about a very interesting little movie called Wine Diamonds, at least he references it. And we talk about white winemaking, sweet winemaking, and much more. Buckle in, maybe grab a notepad, and enjoy. Oh, and some of the things that Clark references, his presentation on the 4 different kinds of white winemaking, his presentation on oxygenation in wine, will be available with his permission at organicwinepodcast.com. on his episode page. So check it out there for more information and the full presentation, which he covers in this episode. Clark, welcome. Thank you so much for this conversation.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you. It's a privilege, Adam.
So I have mentioned to a couple people that I will be talking to you, and universally these were winemakers or people in wine, and they've all universally been aware of your book, Postmodern Winemaking. I just spoke to somebody who said, when I mentioned I would be talking to you, said, I read it every year before harvest.
Cool.
Yeah. And so, that came out in 2013. And yet I think we're still having the same conversations that you were having then were, there's same debates with the same level of misinformation are still being had. But
Yeah,
before
it's
we jump,
weird. When I published the book in 2013, I thought that 5 years later it would be just common knowledge and not really interesting anymore. Um,
right, right.
I really thought people would catch on and go, "Oh, okay, well that makes
So you,
sense." And
so you're
then, but now the sales of my book are stronger than ever, and the conversation is finally kind of getting underway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope I can help with that. I mean, it sounds like you're an optimist based on your assumptions about how people's thoughts would change quickly in response to your book. But can you talk a little bit about your history in wine, like how you got into it and what it's meant in your life, where it's taken you?
Well, I sort of started life as a MIT dropout in 1971. It was a wonderful time, and uh, the heads of the departments teach all the freshman classes at MIT. So I got to have, Francis Crick of the double helix taught me molecular biology, and
Wow.
Noam Chomsky taught me linguistics, and there
Wow.
were like 12 of these guys. And and plus I was doing a lot of folk music. And so I had like 13 careers to choose from. And then I got to the junior year and they made me choose one. So I left because I just I didn't know. I wanted to
Yeah.
take some time off and think about it. Wandered out to California, got a job in a liquor store, and suddenly I kind of found my bliss. I was looking for something that was new, where there was a lot of discovery yet to happen. So, I wasn't really interested in working out the periodic table, which, been around for 100 years. I wanted to do something new, and particularly that merged science and art. What it is, what's the nature of the physical world, and how does that affect what it is to be human?
Hmm.
And once I understood what was going on in wine, I thought, oh, okay, I got to do this. So I worked retail for 5 years. At that time, believe it or not, there were only 250 wineries in the country. Uh, and I met all the winemakers in the United States, 250 wineries. And it wasn't very hard to do over the course of 5 years. Now there's 12,000 wineries, so it's
Yeah.
impossible to meet them all. But the other thing that was really neat about the wine industry back then is that people from other industries would marvel at how open we were, and how we were exchanging information all over the place. And that's because we didn't know anything. Half the wines on the shelf would be considered unmerchantable today. So we needed to talk to each other. And unfortunately, for a number of reasons, that openness has disappeared in the wine
Yeah.
industry, and now it's pretty shut down. But that really attracted me, and I was able to make an impact. Partly because most of the people that got into the industry were not innovators. They didn't want to do something new. They wanted to do something old. And so, for example, when I got my patents on alcohol adjustment and VA removal with reverse osmosis, that patent there were 150 patents in the U.S. Patent Office since 1880. So about one a year, and it
You
was
mean about
ridiculous.
wine?
About one a year, which I mean, there's been 150 patents in San Jose since breakfast, because that's what
Wow.
everybody was up to. But they weren't, and so that allowed me to
Are you
come in
saying
and do
total or
something
just in the area of wine there were that many patents?
just in the area of wine.
Okay. Whew. I was like, man,
Yeah, no, but about one a year.
wild. So, well, I also, I mean, it sounds like I want to ask you how wine grabbed your attention. But by doing that, I just want to say that the philosophy, your winemaking philosophy on the winesmith.com, is the practical art of connecting the human soul to the soul of a place by rendering its grapes into liquid music.
Yep.
And for somebody who sounds like you came from a hardcore science background, and have approached things pretty scientifically, and technologically, that sounds like a pretty soulful and deeper connection to wine. Can you explain that disparity?
Well, as I said, I had always been looking for something that was science in service to art.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think I found that. Um, you got to remember, I'm a musician too. So,
Hmm.
and actually, one of my books is The Practical Art of Pairing Wine and Music. It's incredibly uh, startling just
Hmm.
how much I can make you love or hate anything with my iPod.
Right. Right. I've heard about
So,
these experiments. Sounds fun.
yeah. So, anyway, what happened to me is uh, I remained a dropout for 9 years. I spent 5 of them working in retail. So at that time, there were only about 1,000 wines being made in the United States,
Hmm.
and I worked at a place called Jackson's Wine and Spirits, uh, and we had another 1,000 from Europe, and those were the wines we really studied. Nobody really knew what they were doing in, say, Cabernet, but the Bordelais sure did, and our Pinots were nowhere near as good as the Burgundies. So, those were the wines that we studied and put together tasting groups and tasted all the time. And so that's how I cut my teeth.
Hmm.
And then I finally, in 1980, went to Davis, finished up the bachelor's, and took all the master's degree programs, but I never actually published my thesis because I got snapped up by some local farmers, the Jagir family, and we started R.H. Phillips in 1982. Well, no, 1983. Uh, and we were 3,000 cases and about $2 million in debt. And, and then, so I got a chunk of the company and we took it to 300,000 cases and sold it for a
Wow.
nice chunk of change.
Nice.
But that's when I was much more interested in doing something practical than doing something academic where it's really frustrating in the university when you give out these assignments to the students and it's kind of a relentless game of fetch the stick, with no real value being created. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I was much more interested in the private sector.
Yeah.
So I did that at Phillips for 7 years, and then I hung out my shingle as a consultant in 1990, and so I guess I've been doing that for, what is it, 33 years.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, I know it's and as it turned out, I mean, history would conspire to put you at this place and time where you developed and worked with some of the techniques and technologies that are really like define modern winemaking or postmodern winemaking, I should say. Um, and some criticism came your way. I mean, just by following your bliss and trying to make better and better wine, uh, I think you just found yourself at the center of things that you didn't even realize that you were at the center of, sort of cultural wars that had nothing to do with winemaking.
it's not exactly right. I'm from Jersey.
Okay,
I like
all
to
right.
pick a fight, and
Okay, good. All right. Yeah.
I like to tell the inconvenient truth.
All right. All right.
And that's kind of not the way Californians are. They kind of mellow out, uh, and so I was able. It was a great privilege, really, to be able to be in the middle of uh, the wine technology revolution and try to marry it with this, artistic need that all winemakers have.
Hmm.
There's I always tell I have about 120 wine winery clients were doing startups all the time, and none of these people, I'm talking about the entire industry, there's nobody in it for the money.
Yeah.
I'd
Amen.
say never be a winemaker or a jazz musician unless you have to. And so I love these people, and I
Yeah.
think they're getting a rotten deal. It's our own fault because we aren't explaining to people what's going on. But
Yeah.
that honesty and openness has kind of inadvertently gone away because we're chicken shit to tell people what we do and why we do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I see this too. So I mean, I think some of the, well, I would say some of your controversy wasn't with Californians; it was with New Yorkers, if I'm not mistaken. Like, well, at least another, Alice Firing, for example. Um, I mean, I'm sure you have a decent relationship, but it sounds like you came under her criticism to a certain extent. Um,
My
but
relationship with Alice is interesting. Uh, I really don't think. I think Alice is pretty much a self promoter,
Hmm,
and doesn't care a whole lot about you know intellectual debate about what's really going on. But I will say, I had a really interesting conversation with her. Uh, I was showing her. Uh, we have this wine we made at Napa Valley College called Faux Chablis. It's 100% Chardonnay, no malolactic, and the secret to Chablis. People think that you pick Chablis underripe, and that's not true. If you go to Chablis, you're going to see that those are yellow clusters,
hmm,
and the seeds are brown. And um, and when we do that in California, because our air is too dry, that means we're talking about like 14.8 alcohol.
right.
And the wines are hot and bitter. So we use reverse osmosis, which creates a filtrate. We call it a permeate. It has alcohol in it. We can distill that alcohol out, put the water back. That's a very simple invention. It's amazing that nobody had ever thought of it before. And that allows me to find a balanced sweet spot. Usually, in that wine is around 12.9%. So I poured Alice the the wine that we had pulled the alcohol out, and then I gave her also the original wine before we did that. And she made a really interesting comment. She said that and it's really true, that the alcohol adjusted wine had more terroir character. You could
Hmm,
get the minerality. We were dealing with a living soil there where we just let the weeds go there at Napa College. And
hmm,
Steve Krebs and I just wanted to make this. We want to show people at Napa that you don't have to make a big ball buster, that you can make an elegant wine that tasted like real French Chardonnay. Uh, but part of that was to get the minerality from the living soil and fostering the hypogeous fungi and all that. And that worked really well, but it could be hidden under all the alcohol, the bitterness, and you couldn't taste the minerality in the finish. And so she said, "Well, you got a lot more terroir characteristic in the altered wine, but the unaltered wine is more authentic."
hmm.
And I thought that was an interesting thing to say. Uh,
Yeah.
and so that's kind of the gimme spots on my apples kind of, if that's the way the vineyard really is, and that's what it's giving you, then I want that to be presented.
Right.
Now, the reason this is bullshit is she's just condemned the entire vineyard of France, because in France you get a lot of rain and your brixes are low and you make wines that are thin and salty. And so for 200 years we've been following Dr. Shopdall's advice and adding sugar. Note that
Hmm,
this never appears on a label, but even in a good year you're going to add 10 grams per liter, and in a bad year you'll add 20, and that goes for all the first growths and everything else. And that's because the terroir is it's so much more complex uh, than just what the Brix is. Brix really has nothing to do with ripeness. It only has to do with how much alcohol you have. And so there's a point of balance, maybe several, uh, but in between, the wines don't taste very good. So uh, you're trying to combine the soil type and the temperature and the wind and the light exposure of the canopy and soil fertility and many other factors like altitude and longitude. Uh, and none of that, uh, that's just too much to manage. And also to get the alcohol to be in a sweet spot. It's kind of like if you were farming soup and you wanted the salt to be exactly right. Well, nobody does that.
Well, it also to me, it's like to make the perfect wine. That means there's like two places in the world where you can do that. You know what I mean? Like that's the other side of it. Like, and that's on a good year. You know what I mean? Like, does that ring true to you as well?
Yeah, and why would you? What is evil about alcohol adjustment?
Well,
It just
what's
makes better wine, and you're able to, as I said, dial it into a sweet spot. Your chances of being in a sweet spot without adjustment are about 1 in 6.
right, right, and well, here's my other. I have multiple questions, but while you mentioned that, why would you adjust with RO instead of water to decrease alcohol?
Well, we do use water.
Right. I mean, but
Uh,
if you had your druthers, and what would you choose and why?
well, when the fruit comes in, uh, we're the type of ripeness that I'm looking for is usually going to be around 24 to 25 bricks.
Hmm.
Maybe if I'm lucky, 23.5. But that's going to result in more alcohol than I want. And so I'm going to go ahead and water that, basically replace the water that evaporated from the grape and take it
Right.
down to about 23.5. But that doesn't mean it's going to be on a sweet spot.
Right.
So I really kind of do a combination of both, and
Okay.
and sometimes I'll just add a little alcohol back. You know,
Yeah. If you
we'll
need
try
it.
a
Yeah.
whole. We'll look at tenths of a percent of alcohol, and we'll find where the wine sings.
Hmm.
So water is that big knob,
Right.
and technology is the fine tuning.
Huh. That's really that's remarkable. Do you saunier when you add water, or not
A
because you're
lot of
gonna
people do
RO?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem in California with Seigneur is that if you're making a red wine and you pull the juice off, uh, then it's going to be really high alcohol. And I love dry rosé, especially the Provençal style. But in California, if you don't water like a lot, then that ripe Seigneur juice will be over 14% alcohol, and it'll taste awful.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I'll actually water down to about 21.5 and end up with wines in the 12s, and I think
Yeah.
makes uh, much better rosé and more of it.
Right. 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 Free wine. Um, turning water into wine. All right. So we were talking about watering back.
Yeah, I might sound cavalier about these large water additions. I have a really hard time persuading my clients to get their final alcohols under 14, which means diluting to 23 bricks. And,
Right.
they get kind of crazy when I ask them to add a bunch of water. And that's because they don't understand colloid chemistry. They're afraid that they'll dilute the flavor and density, but actually, the opposite is true. Anthocyanin pigments and other flavor components are only sparingly soluble in wine. They all you can get is a light rosé, and they can only be extracted into copigmentation colloids. Now, a copigmentation colloid is a kind of a coagulation of phenolic ring structures driven together by water activity. So it's like it's like a corral for color and flavor phenolic rings, and these colloids, they're dependent on high water activity. At high alcohol, they don't exist at all.
Oh.
And at lower alcohol, the wines actually become denser and more highly extracted. Yeah, I know. You have to. I got to get them to trust me. And usually, the first year they don't. They add about half as much water, and then they end up with wines with 15% alcohol that are kind of terrible. And well, that's because you didn't do what I told you. Um, Now, the other aspect of this is that the aromatics, uh, esters, terpenes, thiols in both red and white wines, they're what we call apolar. So they hate water.
Hmm.
And what that means is that at low alcohol, which is to say high water activity, they're pushed up into the gas phase. So we're saying we're increasing the aromatics, and also they're not masked by alcohol. So,
Ah,
for example, German Rieslings at 8% are some of the most aromatic wines in the world.
right. That's fascinating. And I mean, I'm just throwing out a random question, but
Mhm.
when you're watering back, you're also acidulating the water, right?
Oh no. This is the other thing people don't understand. That's a great question. You can take a wine and add tenfold its volume uh, in water, distilled water, and the pH doesn't change.
What?
Well, the TA obviously, is
Right.
going to be diluted, but pH is the balance of the all the acids and their conjugate bases. It's the ratio of the two, and when you dilute, it doesn't change. So no, you don't acidulate the water. Basically, the water has no buffer capacity, and so when you add it, it doesn't change the pH.
Wild.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you acidulate, which I know, I mean, that's standard practice when you water back,
Oh,
right?
I'm not saying we don't. Well, they're unrelated.
Okay.
Y- Uh,
No, but I mean, yeah, like I guess what I was thinking is you'd add, 3.5 grams per liter or something, or 5.5 grams per liter to get to, a sort of a TA, like thinking of it from a TA standpoint, to what, per volume of water that you would add back to keep a balance in the flavor of the finished wine. I mean, that's pretty standard practice that I've heard of, right? Like,
no, I
and you're,
wouldn't. That's a huge acid added. We never add that much. Uh, it's a little bit complicated to explain, but basically, you want all of your juices to start at about pH 3.45.
yeah.
So if it's a white wine, the chemistry of tartaric acid is very strange. Uh, you would think when uh, you would think when you acidify, you lower the pH and raise the TA, and that's true. But with whites, if anything you're below pH 3.6 and the potassium bitartrate comes out, like
Hmm.
cold stabilization or just during
Right.
fermentation, the TA goes down, which makes sense, but the pH also goes down. um, yeah, you have to look at the equilibrium chemistry to understand why that's true.
Yeah,
But
I've heard about this. Yeah.
what you want to do is drift into the ideal zone for white wine making, which for non-malolactic wines like Sauvignon Blanc is down around 3.2, 3.25, and for richer, rounder wines like Chardonnays with malolactic, you want to be around 3.4. So you have this ideal zone for whites.
Right.
With reds, you start at 3.5. Now, I'm talking about at the moment of crush. And most of the time, winemakers don't even read their pHs and Brixes until a 24-hour soak.
Right.
But let's pretend you knew what the Brix was and the pH was at three uh, at the moment of crush. So 3.45 skin contact that you do in all reds is going to give you a rise of about zero point 0.2. So now instead of 3.45, you're at 3.65. And then the malolactic, depending on how much malic acid you have, will give you another rise from between zero point 0.1 and zero point 0.2.
Right.
So that means that you float into this zone, which I think is ideal. Uh, you want your light reds like Pinot Noir to be at about 3.7, and you want your big reds like Cabernet to be at about 3.8, 3.85 for the really tannic ones.
Uh-huh.
And there's another little nuance here, which is if you have a big cab and it's going to age for several years, at least 2 years in barrel, then you actually want to start at about 3.9 or 3.95 because the SO2 you're adding during aging is going to oxidize to sulfuric acid, and that will raise the TA and lower the pH. So you drift into this 3.85 pH with as low a TA as you can get. You really want your TAs to be around 5 or maybe less because then you have less salivation coming in from the stimulation by the TA, and less protein in the saliva means a softer wine that's not as harsh and crude as it would be at a higher T. That's not a problem with Pinot Noir because there's hardly any tannin in there anyway, so it's all right for the TA to be up in the sixes with a pH around 3.7.
Right. Huh.
It's actually
Amazing.
kind of a beautiful dance that
Yeah.
the wine chemistry just does all on its own if you start at
Yeah.
3.45. So
Yeah.
that's an easy thing to remember. The justification for it and how it all folds out, it takes me about a half a day to explain that in a class.
Yeah,
Uh,
I get that.
Winemaking fundamentals made easy.
So, but the bottom line for this in terms of adding water,
Yeah,
it actually increases the density, the sort of color and aromatics of the wine, of a red
yeah,
wine.
yep, that's right.
um, now you brought up adding SO2 in barrel for long aging, but you also talk about how that might not be as necessary as people think it is. There's a lot of myths around that,
That's
and
right.
I'll definitely link to that article that you wrote for Winemaker magazine. But do
Yeah,
you want to cover some
there's
of?
a little known article by um, uh, Hélène Funel. She's a professor at the University of Bordeaux, and she uh, did this experiment that proved that the anthocyanin pigments that bind the SO2, there really isn't any free SO2 in red wine. When you measure it, what you're really doing is you're really measuring also those the bisulfite that's bound to pigments because it's in rapid equilibrium with the free, and so when you titrate the free, you get that stuff too, but it's not effective against acetobacter, and that's hardly anybody knows that. So what
That's
really
crazy.
keeps your wine from turning to vinegar is its reductive strength, its ability, its antioxidative power.
And
That's
where
what
does that come from?
it comes from not picking the grapes when they're overripe. Yeah, this is what true phenolic ripeness really is, and a young winemaker will try to avoid that because when the wine has high reductive strength, sort of a strong immune system, then it closes up and the tannins can be hard, and the fruit can be suppressed when the wine is young. Not,
Right.
when it gets older, then the wine will open up. But these wines can even make H2S, and so if you let them
Right.
hang forever, then they taste great when they're a year old, and then after 2 or 3 years, they just fall apart.
Yeah. I've had that experience. So it's
Yeah,
that's the
this is the
tasting
typical
room.
California wine
Yeah,
experience,
you love it in the
especially
tasting
if you're
room and you
paying
take
like
it
three or
home and
four
open
hundred
it.
dollars for a Napa Cab.
Right, right. And it's that I definitely have had that where you're like you taste it in the tasting room, you love it, and then when you open it at home, you're like, this is a different wine entirely and it's nowhere near as good kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um now so when like essentially it sounds like you don't really if you're picking, whole well-grown grapes that are not overripe, that are optimally ripe but not like damaged or overripe, you don't really need sulfur for a long time. I mean, do you advocate using sulfur at all if everything
Well,
else is
I
in balance?
I make sulfite free wines.
Sulfite, I should say sulfite instead of sulfur. Sorry, I know
Right.
that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a bugaboo, but I won't scold you. Um,
No, I'll scold myself so you don't have to.
but the guys at Davis will tell you that without SO2, the wine has to be kept cold all the time. It has to be drunk within a year of vintage, and that's just not true. My best wines are the ones that I age without any SO2 for 5 or 6 years in old barrels, and then even then when I bottle them, like my 2014 is still pretty reductive, and it tastes better when it's been decanted and left open for several days. But these are wines that are extraordinarily profound.
Right.
Oops,
And you're not adding
let me say that again. Uh, these are wines that are extraordinarily profound.
and you're not adding anything at bottling either. Like you don't feel
Right.
like this is the
Nope.
thing that you hear all the time.
You don't
Like I
have
don't
to.
add sulfites, but I just add a little at bottling.
Yeah, which is, what do you want to do? Kill off the microbiome that's going to give you your uh, bottle bouquet? It's kind of crazy.
Right.
Um,
Huh.
oh, what was I
That's
going to say? Oh, yeah. Uh, I don't really advocate making sulfite free wine unless you really know what you're doing. So I have
mm,
a class called Advanced Red Winemaking, and it addresses all of these issues of structure, importance of uh, growing for the building blocks, and then how to create that structure, enological oxygen, and the management of a microbial equilibrium in the cellar rather than just killing everything and trying to avoid sterile filtration at bottling. All this stuff, you got to have all of that under your belt before you're ready to make sulfite free wine. I'm talking about reds. I don't even know how to make sulfite free whites, but Paul Fry's pretty good at it, but he just avoids oxygen altogether, and that's not what I encourage. Oxygen, but anyway, the way I say it is possible to climb Mount Everest without an oxygen mask, but only masters and morons attempt it. And for everybody else, you have to learn all of these pieces before you can really make great sulfite free wine.
Hmm. I like that. Well, I mean, I'm sorry we went into some details there. I guess really what I wanted to get at was, I think your approach is honesty and openness, and you advocate for that. And I personally really appreciate that. Regardless of whatever you're doing, at least stand behind it. Like don't lie about it. And I feel like we have built this culture, at least in the natural wine culture, that I've seen that incentivizes dishonesty. Incentivizes sins of omission. Like you just don't talk about the things that you do that would scare some people, or would offend some people.
Sounds like a bad marriage, doesn't it?
It
Where
does.
say the husband is looking at some other gal, and you know, in a good marriage, you there's openness and honesty, and I got these hormones. What am I supposed to do, honey? Uh,
Right.
but there's there's kind of a history of this. I think it's really our own fault that we've made some bad choices as winemakers. But let's put the whole thing in historical context.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking, as I said, nobody's in it for the money, and uh, everybody wants what the natural wine movement wants. Nobody wants to poison anybody, and but we do want to make
Right.
good wine too. Uh,
Right.
so, all right. So you could argue that it's inauthentic or unnatural to add water to must, but excuse me, I'm going to make better wine, and that's what I'm going to do if need be. And it's really just replacing the water of evaporation.
Right.
Okay, so
Well, and
really, um, there is no such thing as traditional winemaking anywhere in the world anymore,
right. Right.
and that's because who doesn't want electric lights in their cellar? But if you took a winemaker for any time period of history before 1900 and you took them to a winery today, they wouldn't recognize that they're in a winery.
Right.
So we've got electric lights, stainless steel, electric pumps,
Plastic.
refrigeration,
Well,
plastics. All these things have happened. They weren't noticed. You would go to a winery, let's say in 1970s, see all these things and not be horrified uh, because you have them all in your kitchen.
right.
And it won't be long before people have enough ROs underneath their sink that won't seem weird either. But at that time, we got into, let's say, in the 80s, and we were doing reverse osmosis and enological oxygen and many other innovations that we did not explain. Why? Well, partly, most winemakers didn't understand how they worked anyway. They just knew the result. Uh, and I think we made a mistake there. It's sort of the opposite of the way the top chefs went. Wolfgang Puck would get on TV and he'd say, I got this really ripe brie here, but I want to grate it so I can put it in my puff technology. So I'm gonna freeze it with liquid nitrogen so I can grate it. You want to watch? There he is on TV, pouring liquid nitrogen over this ripe brie. And we should have been doing that too, because these new technological innovations are really cool, and we should be bragging about them. And if we're not willing to brag about them, then we shouldn't do them.
Right.
That's not the road we took. And so I don't think I don't
Well,
think uh, that the wine writers knew why they were being lied to. Uh,
right. Right.
but they could tell there was something that wasn't right. And so they started making shit up. What
Right.
is it these guys are embarrassed about to tell me? And so it got to the point where this just about 2000 the whole thing exploded. That's when Alice came on the scene and Letty Teague. By the way, I have all of these articles from that time on winecrimes.com.
Hmm.
So that's a fun place to read about the dark side of wine, and
I love it.
wine is made in the lab, not the vineyard. And,
Right.
because I wanted all those articles to be there so that real journalists could go in and read them and make their own choice about what was really going on. So most people didn't do that. They just said, "Oh yeah, I." What they really say is, "I do the minimum."
Right.
What the hell does that mean? Everybody does the minimum. To do things costs money. Uh, but that's kind of what they're saying, and what resulted is most winemakers keeping their heads down while the natural wine pundits fire live ammo over their heads.
Yeah.
So now, I'm just begging people to A, don't do anything that you're ashamed of and don't want to brag about. And B, tell your stories because they're kind of fun.
Right. Right. Right.
And I think that's the solution to healing this bad marriage is by inviting winemakers to explain their choices and give them a place where they can feel safe to do that.
Well, and I
Enological oxygen is a great example. I mean,
yeah, I was gonna
honestly,
say
just how
there's some
evil can that possibly be?
yeah. Well, this is the thing. I was going to say there is some hypocrisy in I think some of the prohibitions or these senses of offense that are taken by for some of these things because as I was saying to you, it's like I know so many natural winemakers who don't blink an eye at using dry ice, and yet you are a big proponent, or I don't know if you're a proponent, but we're going to talk about oxygenation, and microoxygenation is a technological development in wine that has some real advantages if you choose to use it. At least it's a really useful tool, can be a really useful tool. And all you're adding is air. Like you're literally just adding air. Yes, it's a technological thing, but how different is that than dry ice, and how much technology is required to produce dry ice to blanket your natural wine so that it's protected while you don't inoculate it and it sits there for 4 days before the fermentation kicks off. It's like I think that's just a really weird line to draw in some ways. Like, and I draw the line of like, well, I can't afford the technology, and that's kind of why I end up doing natural wine, because my I can only afford peasant winemaking. But if I could afford it, then like for me to be offended by it, or for me to just be offended by microoxygenation seems really strange. Like it seems like a hypocritical. Um,
Did I
anyway,
ever did I ever
yeah,
send you that article I just wrote for Winemaker magazine about enological oxygen?
yes, yes, and I'd love to get into that
So
for sure.
there's a whole box in there about what you can do if you don't have any money.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
I
Yep.
think the word technology is pretty loaded. Uh,
Yeah, that's true.
what does it mean? What's the difference between a cooking technique and a cooking technology?
Hmm.
It's just that we don't understand it and we're sort of afraid of it. So working with oxygen for me is not a technology. It's a technique. It's something I know
Right.
how to do.
Right. Well, to get into that, let's start at the beginning. The thing that you have come to the way that you've come to understand wine. Like what is wine?
Well, I told you I went to Davis and got these degrees and learned modern enology, which it teaches that wine is a chemical solution and that oxygen is the enemy of wine, which is a misquote of Émile Pénaud at the University of
Hmm.
Bordeaux in the 60s. So at RH Phillips, I was using all this modern stuff, and then I had the opportunity to work through the Benziger family with Pascal Ribeiro-Guéant, who was the director of the University of Bordeaux, on a project uh, making a single blend from vineyards all over the world. And he taught me a lot about tannin. None of us had ever learned anything about texture at Davis. It was all the aroma wheel, and so I was
Right.
pretty ignorant. And he taught me about the different kinds of tannin, and he taught me a lot about ripeness. And he's the guy that told me, if I was growing Cabernet here, I'd let it hang to 27 bricks and then water it down, because your grapes aren't ripe when ours are ripe, bricks wise.
Right. Right.
Uh, well, then because I had developed this technology, I had a a company that was founded in 1992 called Vinovation, and we were doing all this RO stuff and some ultrafiltration and a bunch of other technologies, and we became kind of a magnet for other technologies from overseas, particularly France.
Right.
So here I am in a bar at the MGM Grand Hotel in Reno, Nevada, 1997. And this guy named Thierry Lemaire, who was uh, a lieutenant of Patrick Ducournau, who developed microlox. And so he bought me a beer, and he told me that he had a technology that uh, that could stabilize color, increase mouthfeel, balance sulfides, incorporate uh, Brett and veg and oak, and uh, all my daughters would marry doctors, and it was outrageous, and I didn't believe him for a second. Uh, but a lot of people were curious about this technique, so we agreed to take it on because nobody else would. And I put this thing on the website that said, we're doing trials. Any winery that wants to sign up, we ended up with 12 wineries. uh, we'll study this. It sounds like horseshit to us, but let's wait and see. And then 2 years later, I took that down. Like I said, strangely enough, this really works. And all I had to do was exactly the opposite of everything I'd been taught and believed. So, yeah, it's really a powerful technique. And then added to that were a bunch of other enological oxygen. One of them that you do when you have high tannin grape juice, principally the aromatic varieties like Muscat and Riesling,
Yeah.
and it's called hyperoxidation, where you brown the juice. You don't add SO2, and the juice turns into mud, but then it precipitates out, and you end up with a wine that's lighter and brighter and cleaner than the control.
Huh.
And that was kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
Uh, the first time you do it, you want to kill yourself, It's
You're like, I
very
ruined it.
scary.
Yeah.
But it really works. And then you have macro oxygenation, which is adding oxygen in the middle of fermentation. Does not affect the tannins. It just feeds the yeast. You usually add some nutrients at the same time. And this is to prevent stuck fermentations and prevent formation of sulfides and all that stuff.
Okay.
So then, at the moment of dryness, you can come in. Let's say it's a Napa Cabernet, and you're going to be giving it. This is micro-ox. You want to feed the wine at a rate that is slower than the wine can react up. And believe it or not, at that point, a Cabernet will absorb between 60 and 80 times what a barrel can give it.
Wow.
And it results in structure and color stabilization, and you just make these rich, dense wines that age for a long time. That's phase one. Once you add SO2, people don't realize this, but SO2 inhibits the wine's natural immune system considerably. And
Right.
so that very same wine that was taking 60 now will only take 5. And it's
Huh.
because SO2, unlike what everybody thinks, is not an antioxidant. And in fact, it inhibits the wine's natural immune system, particularly in
Right.
reds.
Huh.
Uh,
We might have
so
to get more into that, but I don't want to break your train of thought. But
Well,
that's
I'll have to
really
send you
fast.
the article. Who did I write that for? Um, I think that was Winemaker Magazine also. That's a
Okay.
heck of a good rag. It's not for winemakers, it's for home winemakers.
Right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But
I,
yeah, there's where did I send that? Uh, uh,
So do you,
it's just kind
yeah.
of, everything you know about SO2 uh, just ain't so. Uh, so
That's
then phase three is, the problem with barrels is if they're not really old, and I don't own any barrels that are less than 20 years old, but if you have a barrel that's, say, 3, 4, 5 years old, it doesn't have any flavor, any positives to it, but it does have a whole lot of green, pithy tannins that uh,
uh,
so when the wine is ready to bottle, except that it has this harsh, pithy wood tannin, then you'll take it out of barrel and run it at a very low rate, usually less than 1 milligram per liter, and just give it a tannin haircut.
huh.
And then finally, there's cliquage, which is what you do when you're expecting, uh, you know, Parker or somebody like that to be visiting the winery, and you want to push the wine ahead. You want to open
Mm.
it up because a healthy wine will be closed and maybe even making little sulfides. So if you give it a little blast of oxygen, then it'll open up at least for a while. You might do that the week before the great man comes. Uh,
So is that would that be like a splashy rack essentially?
yes,
Got it. Okay.
except it's easier
Oh.
because you don't have to move the wine. You just
Oh.
you just put the diffuser in the barrel and you hit this remote control and it turns on across the room. You've got your doser that has a solenoid on it. So when you hit the remote, the solenoid goes click, but it's a French solenoid, so it goes click. And that's where the term cliquage comes from. See what I mean?
Uh,
Some of this stuff is hilarious. So why wouldn't you want to brag about that? Uh,
well, now, where? Thank you for doing this. Wait, have we gotten through enological oxidation or oxygenation,
yeah,
which is different?
that's the short course.
Yeah.
I would say that phase one microrocks in particular is very tricky. Half of the benefit of it is that you're just looking at the wine 3 times a week and making choices about where you want to go with it. So uh, you can't. It's you're sort of making a tannin souffle, and the oxygen is the wire whisk, and you have to
Mm,
separate the lees from the clear wine, which is kind of like separating eggs to make a souffle, where you
huh,
start by making a meringue, and then after you've built that structure, you bring the yolks back to coat the structure and add fatness. So that's exactly the same as how you make a tannin souffle to make a rich light structure that has the properties of aromatic integration and soulful resonance and uh, graceful longevity.
mm,
And you can't, somebody has to teach you. Somebody has to show
right.
up. You got to pay a consultant or another winemaker that knows how to do it to show you how to do it. And it takes about 3 vintages before you're able to do just about everything. So
Huh.
you'll start with one diffuser, and by the time you're done, you'll have a diffuser for every tank in the winery.
Huh. Okay. Well, so you just mentioned the tannin souffle, and when I asked you what is wine, I've heard you talk about this as a more fundamental thing. I can you go back to that, like the fundamental, just like what is the actual liquid of wine and how is it misunderstood? Like, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, this is the
I get
big,
it.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, um, and so I contrast modern and postmodern views of wine. Uh, modern winemaking is based on making good wine. Uh, and when Davis got into the game in the late 60s and early 70s, they did a lot of good to teach people how to make wine that wasn't spoiled.
Right.
Uh, but in doing so, I think the dogma uh, steered people away from uh, the possibility to make great wine. Uh, so, well, let me ask you a question. What uh, is it true or false that the sensory properties of a wine are a consequence of the chemical constituent? So I'm talking about the appearance, the color, the aroma, the flavor, and the texture. Are
Well,
those a
I
consequence of the chemical makeup?
well, I have an unfair advantage from having read your book, so I would say it's false.
Most people have two responses. One is, well, true. And the other is, of course it's true. Why are you asking me such a stupid question?
Right.
So then I ask another question. Uh, are the sensory properties of a lump of coal, uh, a graphite tennis racket, and a diamond a consequence of their chemical makeup? And by the way, they're all 100% carbon.
Right. Right.
Okay,
Uh,
so if that's obviously not true, what's the difference? What's the missing key?
right. Structure.
Yeah, and I don't mean structure the way masters of wine talk about structure. They'll talk about like the Vidal uh, uh, triangular graph where you're looking
Right.
at a balance point between astringency and acidity and sucrosity.
Right.
And where you are in there determines the structure. But that structure's happening in your head. And it
Right.
isn't,
Right.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about actual googe that we're building in the wine. So wine chemically has a lot more to do, resembles much more something like chocolate. Or you could say the difference between a consomme and a lobster bisque. The bisque has structure to it. It's got googe in it, and or a béarnaise sauce where you don't smell the tarragon and the mint and the onion. You just get this integrated béarnaise thing, and so that's what we're talking about. And I claim that the three great sins of modern wine are uh, too much oak, too much pyrazines, and too much Brett.
Hmm.
And I put it to you that none of those things are problems of composition. They're problems
Mm.
of structure. So, what my book is largely about is how to build a structure that integrates all that stuff. And so it doesn't occur as defects.
Right. And it affects, I mean, when you start to understand, I mean, because from the things that I've read of yours, I mean, this understanding is much more profound than maybe it sounds. Like when you think of it as a colloidal mixture rather than a chemical solution, if I'm getting that right,
Mm-hmm.
um, it it impacts everything. It impacts from how we grow the vines and what we're focusing on in the vineyard.
Right. I
To
talk about in modern enology, you farm for flavors. In postmodern, you're farming for the building blocks of structure, color, copigmentation. I mean, flavors as well, but you're really trying to build an integrative structure.
how how does one do that, and how does that look differently, and how does that relate to minerality, like farming for those things?
Well, nobody knows what minerality is, and I'm not talking about the smell of wet stone. I call that petrichor.
Right.
Uh, I'm talking about the buzz in the finish that is often confused with acidity.
Hmm.
So if you've ever had a Corton, they're loaded with this stuff, or Portuguese port, because the schist in the soils in the Douro impart this characteristic and force the root systems way on down. Uh, Claude Bourguignon told us at Napa College that we could get minerality on any sort of soil if we would knock it off with the pesticides and herbicides, and that really worked. The downside was that mineral aspect in California, we mostly are looking at volcanic soils, decomposed granite, but of course. In France, you have a lot of limestone. You actually have a whole lot of limestone in the rest of the country. Like
Mm.
you get a wine from Kentucky, that whole state is nothing but a great big slab of limestone, and their wines are very minerally.
Hmm.
But California has practically no limestone.
So
Uh,
what does our minerality taste like?
well, it's the same. It's this buzz in the finish. Um,
Just less pronounced, perhaps?
well, I wouldn't necessarily say so.
Okay.
We just don't have. I think that there's an aromatic aspect, sort of like violets, that you see in Burgundies so often that we
Hmm.
rarely experience in California.
Ah,
Um, so
understood.
anyway,
Yeah. So when you're farming for building blocks, what does that look like in the vineyard?
well,
Other
you're
than
gonna
not using.
wanna you're gonna wanna get in most cases, not Sauvignon Blanc, which isn't really a structured wine, but you want to make sure there's sunlight on the fruit in the early going because that creates something called quercetin, which is a really good copigmenter. It's not like other grape skin tannins in that it lies flat in the plane, just like an anthocyanin, and so we can we can extract a whole lot more color. And color is kind of the key to structure because it terminates polymerization. That's what we want. We want really short chain oligomers that are maybe 5 to 7 units long. If we don't have good color, then those uh, polymerization just continues until the stuff dries out and drops out of the wine. We want to
Mm.
prevent that. So that's why we're jumping on uh, phase one right after fermentation uh, to stabilize the color and create these short oligomers very quickly before we lose them.
Huh. Gotcha. And
So you gotta open up the canopy. Then uh, you have to be careful about your water in the spring. You don't want to get to the permanent wilt point, but you also don't want to have full water because that makes more canopy. And so there's a trick to managing soil water content. And then throughout the summer, you're showing up all the time to make sure that vine balance is in place. And then you gotta choose a time when the fruit is ripe, but where it hasn't field oxidized yet. So
right.
it's probably my fault as much as anybody to give people the ability to pull bricks down. Before me, everybody picked everything at 23.5 if they could get it. And
Uh,
now, we sort of enabled them to pick it anytime they wanted to without teaching them what ripeness is. And I think
mm.
that was a shame. If I had to do it again, I'd work on I'd work more on teaching them when
What
ripeness
is
is.
ripeness? What is it?
Well, there's a point where the anthocyanins, by that I mean monomer, comes to a peak, and then it drops as the color polymerizes on the vine. Um, we're also, there's a really good book about this that got developed by Jacques Rousseau in France, and then a couple of people in Australia, uh, uh, John Whiting and Erica Winter, translated it into English, and it's a great book about how you can track the 25 things there are in grapes to look at, none of which is bricks. Um, so it's a
Right.
long story.
Got
But
it.
you got
Yeah,
to
it's
get to know that
it's a
vineyard.
long answer to a short question. Got it.
Well, and then
Yeah.
you need to keep records and say,
Right.
well, how
Right.
did that go? And
Is it
but
Is there for the lay person without too many tools? Do you have any practical advice for determining ripeness in a more sophisticated way, or a more in a better way to actually be ripe versus bricks?
Woody Allen said that 80% of life is just showing up.
Yeah,
It's very important to get to know the vineyard and the
yeah,
grower and spend a lot more time than you really want to walking that vineyard and tasting and, as I said, looking at all these parameters like seed color and um, the pulp and so many other things that anybody can look at. Uh,
yeah.
and but really developing a personal relationship with the grower and that vineyard is that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, it takes probably multiple vintages to
Yeah.
really start to see what that site, where that site, and see it over different, vintage variation in terms of weather and things like that to see where it expresses its right
Yes.
spot. Lovely. Can you give a glimpse of some of the other things that get impacted by this understanding of wine as this structural thing versus a
Well,
solution?
sure. Most California winemakers are totally paranoid about Brett.
Right.
Brett is a hospital disease. The
Mm.
way to encourage Brett is to kill everything else in the cellar. Um, and there's another issue there. So I'm a big proponent of what we call IBM, Integrated Brett Management, and it has to do with taking it easy on your beneficials. Almost everything that lives in your cellar is a beneficial, and they will outcompete Brett for resources. So let me tell you a little story. Last about a year and a half ago, had a we had a tasting of a bunch of old wines from the 60s and 70s, and Rob Davis from Jordan came along, and there was a guy collector in Hawaii that had brought a bottle of the 76, which was his first vintage, and we tasted it, and it was pristine. It was still nice ruby red. Was had nice clean fruit. Now I knew this wine very well from back when I was retailing, so everybody's going, "Good job, Rob, that thing held up really well." And I said, "Well, the only thing is, I knew this wine very well when I was selling it in 1979, and it tastes exactly the same as it did then." And he said, "Well, my boss really was concerned about Brett, and so we have sterile filtered every bottle that we ever made at Jordan."
Right.
And but then he says, "But let me show you something." So he pulls out a Magnum. And I go, "Well, that's going to be even worse." He says, "Well, hang on." So he pours it around, and what had happened was Andre Telchev was his mentor at that point, and Andre says, "Well, this is the first vintage. We got a bottle about 200 commemorative Magnum." And Rob said, "Well, I can't do that. I don't have the change parts to put Magnums on the line." And he said, "Well, hell, let's just get a siphon hose and bottle it right out of the barrel." And he popped that cork, and I'm telling you, I have never had a better Cabernet.
Wow.
And I'm talking about, I would put that against the first growths in a good year. It was
Wow.
just mind blowing. And I had always kind of suspected this, but that's when I knew for sure that you will never make great wine if you sterile filter it because it's microbial.
Right.
So to me, the the whole game is to make a wine with a good structure, achieve an microbial equilibrium where the Brett and the Acetobacter are outcompeted, and then put it in the bottle. Uh,
Right.
and so, in this way, see, there are so many ways in which I agree with the proponents of natural winemaking. That's certainly one of them.
Right.
But I don't even think there is such a thing as a natural wine movement. I think it's all kind of made up by people that don't make wine. Uh, and Yeah, there's a whole chapter in my book about this where I list the eight constituencies of the natural wine movement. You got the non-interventionist, you got the environmentalist, uh, the conventionalist. Now, if you're a conventionalist, you don't like chips, but if you're
Right.
an environmentalist, you don't like the idea of cutting down barrels. Only 25% of the wood in a 200-year-old tree is can make a watertight container, but you can make better wine with carefully cured and toasted chips. So those guys are on completely separate sides of the movement.
Right.
The I don't know. It's a pretty complex chapter I've got.
Yeah, yeah. I
Uh,
I just refreshed myself reading that, and I was yeah. It's
and that
look, there's
the whole thing is all taken from Alice Firing. What do you care about?
right. That's funny you
And
say that. I work at a natural wine bar, and a couple nights a week, and I people have multiple times said to me, "Are all your wines natural?" And my response has been, "Well, what do you care about?" And usually, sadly, they don't have a response to that. They don't know. They just know that they want natural wine, and I think that is testament to what you're saying. Like there's there's press about it, and so they are attracted to it because they think they should be, or because it's hot or whatever, and yet they don't really even know why they care or why it's important to them personally, even. So it's yeah,
well,
it's
this
it's
comes back to the winemakers just haven't been talking, and
right.
so now we have this sort of myth, which we don't have about Wolfgang Puck because he's so open. We have this myth that everything else is poison, and that's just bullshit. And there are several tenets like the whole idea of what the Australians call feral ferments, the uninoculated. I got no problem with that, but I guarantee all you're really doing is letting other microbes come in and create complexity. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot, and sometimes you get spoiled wines, but you can make nice wines that way,
Yeah.
and it's fine with me. But don't kid yourself that that's not a commercial yeast that actually starts and finishes that fermentation. It's been pretty well documented that those commercial yeasts are pretty much everywhere, and so all you're really doing is a prolonged skin contact.
Right, right. Well, there are other microbes that get a chance to start things off, don't they? Would they be inhibited once Saccharomyces takes over? I
Yes,
mean,
the general rule, they can't handle high alcohol.
got it. Right.
Uh,
So if you
But
have a slow,
one of the things that does happen there is you got a whole lot of yeast and bacteria that produce um, biogenic amines with like histamine, and they have lovely names: cadaverine,
right, putrescine,
putrescine,
right,
uh, and so that methodology you tend to have about 10 times the level of biogenic amines than you would have if you did a conventional startup with a commercial yeast.
right.
So that's usually the choice I make.
But could you would isn't it true that you would also sacrifice some of the complexity of some of the things that weren't necessarily these, sort of terribly named histamine producers, production? I mean, would you
Sure.
lose? Yeah, so you lose some of the other sort of tertiary things that can happen during that build up
Right.
phase.
Right. And I think a lot depends on whether that vineyard has the right microbiome to give you that good stuff
Right,
without
right,
problems. There are, some of the best Zinfandel vineyards in the North Coast, because they're so good, they attract birds, and you end up with fruit flies
yeah,
uh, going after them, and they have vinegar bacteria on their feet, and
right,
so often the best wines turn to vinegar
yeah,
prior to
yeah.
fermentation.
Because they come from such delicious grapes that everybody
Yeah,
else wants them,
makes sense,
right?
right?
Yeah. Um, well, and as you mentioned, I mean, you already talked about it, but both the structure and this idea of a living ecosystem of the wine is what prevents both Brett and the perception of Brett, because you have Brett being out competed by all the other microbes in the wine if you're not using sulfur, and then you have a structure that even if there is Brett that's producing some breadiness, it gets absorbed into that structure. I don't know if absorbed is the right word, but maybe you can correct me on say it better than I'm
Well,
saying it.
I talk about aromatic integration.
Aromatic integration. That's it. There you go.
Yeah, and I mean this really that whole the way that structure works is why Bordeaux is the way it is. Why it isn't squeaky clean. You know, you can take do a tasting of a dozen wines, uh, and 11 California Cabernets and one Bordeaux, and people would think the Bordeaux is spoiled. But do 11 Bordeaux's and one California Cab, and people will think the Cab tastes like Kool Aid.
Yep. Yep.
Uh,
Yeah.
let's talk a little about white wine.
I would love to. Thanks.
I kind of came up. This got left out of my book because I didn't really cook up this idea
Well,
until
it's
years
also
later.
great. I haven't really talked too much about white winemaking, and I think you have such a great uh, breakdown of four different ways, at least four different ways of winemaking that are historic, and I've lots of questions about them. But I'd love you to sort of break that down.
Yeah, this is just something I made up, but it seemed to work pretty well. If we go in reverse chronological order,
Right.
the latest uh, methodology, uh, you could point to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, is total uh, absence of oxygen at any stage. So you're gonna, lots of CO2 being thrown around at the crusher and uh, pressing in a CO2 atmosphere, and then at every stage just protecting the wine so that it never sees any dissolved oxygen. Um, the problem with those wines, as everybody knows, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is just wonderful until it's about a year old, and then it has no shelf life. So the second way is this would be Mosel Rieslings, where they do hyperoxygenation at the juice stage and basically brown out all of the tannins. Now, why do aromatic varieties have lots of tannin? It's because they're so delicious that they attract birds. And so they've all evolved this high tannin structure, just like an apple or a banana, uh, where if they get injured, then that injury will turn brown uh, to sort of cauterize the wound.
Huh.
That tannin is not really good for the wine. It when it sees oxygen, it creates hydrogen peroxide, and that gives you this stale kind of aroma. Uh, so you brown all that out, and even though the juice looks like mud, when you're done with fermentation, you actually have a lighter, brighter wine, which Mosel Rieslings can age 30 years. So it's very different than method one, even though post fermentation you're kind of protecting it.
Right.
And then the third way is, and by the way, those are both pretty new inventions.
Right.
Then the third way, which has been around for a few hundred years, is uh, is to make a wine with as much structure as possible. So you take Chenin Blanc, you press the snot out of it, and then you stir lees every maybe once or twice a week until you coat those tannins, which are initially very harsh, and they finally get to sort of a plump character. You might sneak in a little bit of Viognier or some of Vermentino, some of the aromatic, because those wines will be wonderful when they're a year old, and then they'll close up, and it might take them 5 or even more years to develop this aged character. And in that in between time, it's nice to have a little aromatic juice in there to so the
Make
wine
it palatable.
doesn't like 10%. Otherwise, the wine kind of smells like modeling clay for a while. But when those
Is this
wines get to be 20 years old, they're just unbelievably wonderful.
is that like a Chablis? What would fall into that category? Is that what they
Yeah,
do in Chablis? Yeah.
Chablis, Muscadet sur Lie,
Mm,
Savigny.
got it.
Uh, and then you have what is unfortunately referred to as orange wine, although it's not made from oranges. The Georgians hate that term. Uh, but anyway, skin fermented, and in the case of the Georgian wines, they might be on the skins, seeds, and stems for 6 months or more.
Yeah.
Uh, and then those uh, usually take the better part of a decade to be ready,
Right.
depending
Now,
on just how far you go. And the main point I'm trying to make here to winemakers is pick a direction. Don't mix them up. So, for example, it's really stupid to make a wine that's never seen any oxygen, a method one wine that's only going to be around for a year or two, and then stir lees, because stirring the lees suppresses the aroma until years later when no one will buy it, even if it's good.
right.
So don't mix them up.
What about where does like Burgundy fall into a white wine production? Like, well, how would you characterize it?
Usually, sort of method three.
Got it. Okay. I mean, I we talked about Chablis, but I just sort of I was thinking like Bone and that sort of what we think of as the New Oak Chardonnays, the Napa Chardonnay style, perhaps.
Oh dear. Well, well, I'm very critical of most Napa Chardonnay producers because they hate their grapes. They
What do you
don't
mean
ever
by
want anybody to taste, Chardonnay in their Chardonnay.
that?
They want them to taste like breakfast,
Right.
lots of toast and butter.
Right.
Um, so that's what we were trying to prove with Faux Chablis, is that there's an alternative, that Napa fruit can really make beautiful wines, and we made them in a method three style. On
Okay.
the other hand, the 2005 is the current vintage, and the '06 isn't ready yet. So I kind of
Yeah.
own that market.
Yeah, that
But they
is a bit
really
of
are
a
extraordinary wines.
yeah. I mean, if only cash flow wasn't a concern for winemakers, we'd make some really beautiful wine.
Yeah,
I
and it wasn't for me.
That's
Winesmith
good. Yeah.
uh, Vinovation was, a service company, and we had lots and lots of wine coming and going, millions and millions of gallons. We we did work for practically every winery in the state, uh, but then we just have a couple of barrels of Crucible over there in the corner. Yeah, it wasn't my day job, so I was able to experiment,
Right.
and now it's evolved into a highly experimental winery with a bunch of varieties nobody ever heard of, like Saint Laurent and Petit Mulsanne and Norton. I make wonderful Norton.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
California's only Norton,
that's
which is funny
amazing.
because
Wonderful.
you got to get that stuff right, and so
Yeah.
California is a really good place to grow Norton, but nobody does because
Yeah, yeah. I think
we're
California is a great place to grow lots of hybrids, and it would cut a
uh,
lot of input in the vineyard down too. A lot of less spraying needed for those hybrids.
that's
But
right. Yeah, were
yeah,
it not for vinifera racism.
exactly right. Um, so about orange or amber wines, I mean, one of the
Mhm.
cool things I think you said in your I think you said this in your book about the the Georgians have like 150 different terms for the different hues of amber that can occur.
Yes, that's right.
With yeah, and which is it's yeah, you think that's that whole idea of like Eskimos and snow. Like the more you get to know something, the more you realize it's a complex and detailed thing.
Yeah, you end up
Um,
with a rich body of distinctions.
right. And I had this epiphany recently, and maybe you can correct me, but when I went through the Quartermaster Somm intro course, we taste, there's the whole tasting component as well as an education. We're tasting wines, we taste a Gewürztraminer. And they say, they start talking about like, how do you determine a Gewürztraminer in a blind tasting? And they were bending over backwards to make this connection between the root Gewürz, which in German is related to spice,
Spicy. Yeah.
right? That you could smell spice in Gewürztraminer, and I was like, you can't. Like, you guys are
I
making it up,
know, I
or
know.
or I'm just like, I have a dumb palate. Like I was really thinking, like I'm an idiot. Like, or I have a dumb palate. I'm very insensitive, and yet like strangely I could detect other things that other people couldn't. So I was like, this is really weird. And like, like, am I just missing it? Like, am I just, I was blaming myself because these are master somms who are telling me this. And then recently, because of the advent of orange and amber wines, I've been drinking a lot of skin fermented Gewürz. And I was like, holy shit, they named this grape when this was probably the way that the wine was made. Like they
Yes,
probably originally named this grape when it was fermented on skins by everybody. Like nobody was thinking about removing the skins at that time.
that's
And
right.
that's where you get the spice. Cause then I was like, holy shit, there it is. Like now I get it. There's Gewürz, And
Very
I say again, sorry.
very insightful.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks. Uh, yeah, I just this idea of the shortness amount of time of what we consider traditional white wine. I really appreciate your historic perspective on so many of these things, and I think if anybody can taste, can we buy your Faux Chablis, the 2005? Is that available?
Yes, at winesmithwines.com. There's only a
Okay,
little bit.
okay. I'm gonna
Uh,
rush over
but
it
I'll
before
tell
I
you
publish this.
the thing to do. I have 9 bottles left of 4 vintages of Crucible, which is my Napa Valley answer to Poyak. Uh,
Ah.
and I have 6 vintages from 2001 to 2006 of Faux Chablis, and a couple other interesting goodies, Cabernet Franc with and without sulfites. Uh, so I've I want to use those wines for to do tastings around the country now that the pandemic is gone, and I basically need 15 people to come up with $200 a seat, and I'll come out there and pour them all in. It's really extraordinary.
That sounds fantastic. All right, that's okay. That will be out in the world now.
Gather
Um,
your friends together.
all right, great. Um, I guess I would if you don't mind. I know you make some dessert wines, some sweet wines, I should
Yes.
say. I don't know if you think that they should be dessert or if they should be consumed at all times of day. But um, this is something that, as far as I understand it, it's very difficult for somebody who considers themselves a natural winemaker to make unless you are going to have a high alcohol wine,
Right.
because the only way to do it naturally is to fortify it when it's in mid fermentation and kill the fermentation with brandy, and so then you're at like 19-20% alcohol. Is there
Not
is
necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay, give me the lowdown. And also, I would love to know if there's a sort of low intervention way to make a low alcohol sweet wine. Is that even possible without sterile filtration and that kind of stuff and cryogenic
I
activity?
would say I don't know of one. I
Okay.
mean, there's things you can do. Uh, Ken Fugelsang used to be really in favor of using carbon monoxide. Um, it works really
Okay.
well, but people freak out. So, uh,
Right.
and
Right. Okay.
there's other technologies like that.
Okay.
Uh,
Would you
well, let's
bottle
start
it like a
with
sparkling carbon monoxide?
let's go through the history of sweet wine.
Okay.
So, um, let's start with champagne.
Ooh. Yeah.
So, what did Don Perignon discover?
What did he discover? The in-bottle fermentation?
No, people have been doing that ever since there were bottles.
Oh,
Method ancien, pet nat, essentially.
right, right. Good point. No, I have no idea.
He discovered dosage.
Massage. Okay, so the
He
finishing.
discovered that if you do an in-bottle fermentation and you disgorge and then you toss in a shit ton of sugar, this is not a sterile process, right? There's still plenty of
Right.
yeast. But when you seal it back up, it doesn't re-ferment because the CO2 suppresses the fermentation. That was his discovery.
Ah.
So
So you can
so they
take the
made sec,
searing acidity and balance it.
demi-sec, and doux. So that's the dry, the half dry, and the sweet.
Uh-huh.
How many grams of sugar was in the dry wine?
Ooh, good question. No idea. I'd be guessing.
Well, so guess.
Oh, I'd say like less than 0.4 grams.
The answer is 60 grams.
All right.
This is like twice the sugar of Sutter Home White Zinfandel. The dry
And
one.
that was the sec. All right.
Then the demi-sec is 90 grams and doux is 120 grams.
I should know that. I should have known that. Yeah,
This was
that all
the
is coming
only
back.
way. I mean, actually, this is the right answer to your question about how do I make like 11% alcohol wine with sugar in it that won't blow up. You make
Bubbles.
champagne.
Right.
All right. So they introduced this to the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and they went apeshit.
Yeah.
Uh, now, champagne is the worst wine in the world. Uh,
Right.
Dry champagne is thin and bland and sour as hell.
Right.
But when you put a whole bunch of sugar in it, now what you've got is alcoholic 7 Up. And the whole court went nuts. And so that's what they made for 300 years. Then the British came along and said, well, yeah, now we'd like a little less sugar. What about 30 grams? And the French said, but it would taste terrible. Well,
Right.
we'll give you pounds sterling if you do. Very well. We'll take your English money and we'll make this awful wine. But we will not call it a beautiful French name like demi-sec or doux. We will call it, and it sounds really bad in French. And this is the only English language designation in France for wine. Extra dry. All right, so then the British come back and they go, well, we'd like it drier still. The
Right.
French, but only an animal would drink such wine. Very well. We would call it brut. Brut is an insult to the British for liking this horrible wine. Okay, so that
I love it.
between, you named it, port and sherry and botrytis wines, and then champagne. These are the only ways to make sweet wine, and champagne was the only table wine that you could make sweet.
Yeah.
All right, along comes Hitler.
Let me ask you a really quick question.
Hmm.
Why, when I start with a high bricks champagne, like base, does it all ferment and blow up the bottle or blow off the cap or whatever? Like, why doesn't it work on that end? Why is it only after disgorgement that I can add, that I can make the
Well,
sugar?
yeah, sure. I mean, you ferment to dryness the first time
Right.
around. It's just the yeast can't grow back up when there's high CO2.
Okay.
Second time around.
Got it. All right.
Okay, so now Hitler comes along, scares the pants off of every politician and scientist in the free world. And if it hadn't been for him, we never would have split the atom. It was expensive.
Hmm.
But, we figured we had to do it. And so we do that. And unfortunately, the Japanese got in the way. And you know what happened. So now we're looking at peacetime nukes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had atomic piles. And an inventive company called Nucleoport figured out that they could slide plastic sheets into these nuclear reactors. The alpha particles would etch little holes in them. And then if they put them in a bath of fluoric acid, the holes would enlarge uniformly. kind of like developing film.
Huh.
And so you timed it, and when you got to a certain size, then you could make either an RO filter or an ultra filter or uh, a sterile filter for wine, depending on the size you wanted. And then you could also test that membrane with something called bubble pointing to see how much nitrogen pressure that filter would hold. You with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So switch gears a little bit here. What was the average alcohol of a California wine in 1960?
12%? 12 and a half?
18.5.
Wait. Okay. All right.
California made nothing but port and sherry for 35 years after Prohibition.
Got
Everybody thinks it was all BV Private Reserve.
it.
Less than 5% of the wine made in California was table wine in 1960.
Got it.
What's the average alcohol of a California wine in 1970?
10 years later. Well, so we're looking at averages. Let's go down to 16.
11%.
Whoa. Okay.
And the reason is Peter Sichel used the nucleopore technology to make Blue Nun Liebfrau milk. And nobody had ever had a modern off-dry white wine before.
Right.
They'd never had one. So by 1967, it was 50-50. And by the time we got to 1970, all the wine from California was Blue Nun knockoff. Gallo Chablis, Almaden Rhine wine, Weibel Green Hungarian, Wenny Gray Riesling, all 11% alcohol and around 2% sugar.
Right.
So now what are the French supposed to do? Everybody and his dog is making sweet wine. So when I first got in the industry in 71, you could still find demi-sec and doux. Now it's almost entirely, it's about 75% brut, and the rest is extra dry.
Right. Right.
So we're talking about 15 grams and 30 grams.
Where does cold duck fit into that?
Yeah, well, it's not a method champenoise. Do you know what do you know where the word comes from?
No.
In German, when you have German sausages, right? Let's say it's a
Uh-huh.
balloony, and it has these funky looking round ends on it.
Uh-huh.
So you're slicing it, and then you have these leftover cold cuts. So the German for cold ends or leftovers is kald Ente.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry, kald Ende.
Enda, and it sounds like enta. Yeah, the German word for
Right. Well,
duck. Right.
Ente is the German word for duck.
Right. Right.
So that's where it's
Kald
basically
enta.
leftover wine. It's just saying it's a mishmash. We just threw it all together, put some sugar in it and some bubbles, and it's our junk. Enjoy.
And many people did enjoy it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And why not? You know,
Right.
there isn't. We make fun of people that like sweet wine, but you got to read Tim Hanai's book, "Why You Like the Wines You Like." He
Mm.
defends the people that have, the people that don't like dry, like Cabernets and stuff. It's because they have a higher taste bud density. They're actually super tasters, and they put cream in their coffee and a lot of sugar, and they're just much more sensitive palates.
Mm-hmm. So sweet
Okay,
lips.
so getting back to how do you make sweet wine? I have two products. One of them is it's called Any Gorilla, and that comes
That's
from
great.
in the movie Wine Diamonds, which is about winemaking in the Midwest. You gotta watch this movie; it's really neat.
Okay.
But in the movie, he says, "Well, California winemaker told me one time that any gorilla can make wine in California," and so this stuff was just some leftovers that we had. Uh, a Lodi 2019 cab that was kind of dry and veggie, just didn't work out. And then I had this barrel, I guess I lost track of 2006 Meritage. And so I got a couple of tons of Petite Syrah, from Lake County, wonderful blueberries and stuff like that. We didn't even ferment it. We just took all of that and threw it together with a couple of drums of high proof alcohol and made the most delicious port you can imagine. It was 16.9 alcohol, and it's one of my most popular wines. But it only took an hour to make it. So I got that one, and then I got really interested in Petit Monseigne when I was working with Patrick Ducournau in Madiran. It's a funny situation. The Madiran is it's the red wine appellation, and superimposed on it is the white wine appellation, where you make it's the same geographical territory, but that's where you make Petit Monseigne dessert wine, and that's called Pêcherin de Vic. Nobody's ever heard of that, but many people know Jurançon, and
Uh-huh.
that's the same grape mix. So Petit Monseigne is a crazy grape. It'll get to 32 and a half bricks without any shrivel or botrytis, and it still has a pH of 2.9 and 12 grams per liter of acidity. It's nuts.
Sounds like a wine concentrate in a berry. Like
Yeah, kind of.
you could
So
stretch it
very
out and make
popular in ancient times because it would stick with some sugar.
right, right. Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
there's a thing called Delhi units. Delhi was a Russian scientist in 1905, published this formula. You take the uh, you take the residual sugar in percent plus the alcohol by volume times 4.5. And if that's over 80, then you got a stable wine that won't ferment. So
Hmm.
I really advocate this. If you want to make a natural wine and you don't want to use sulfites and you don't want to filter and any of that stuff, if you can get your deli units up there above 80, then that's the easiest way to make unfiltered organic wine without sulfite.
All right. Okay. I love it. Anything else on that one? On those?
Yeah, we could go on. But
No, we could. Man, this is fantastic. I think I'll have to re-listen to this to learn everything that I just learned. Um, where can people, find out more about your wine and what you're doing?
who,
Winesmith.com, is that the way to go?
who is clarksmith.com?
Who is clarksmith.com? Okay.
And
And
that's
then
dot.
there's winesmithwines.com. That's what I was
Yeah,
thinking.
that's you just click on shop from there.
Oh,
And then
okay.
you,
Who is Clarksmith? Got it.
yeah, and there's a click for the books. There's a click for a postmodern winemaking. Uh, it's got all things postmodern winemaking, and I want to say that the way I make wine isn't the only way to to go. I sort of am trying to make wines that are European in style. I
Hmm.
rarely make a wine that's over 14% alcohol. Wines with a lot of mineral energy, but that's not. There's 360 degrees of direction to go from modern winemaking and the realization that wine is not a chemical solution and so forth. So,
Right.
I
Yeah.
I don't own the idea of what your version of postmodern winemaking would be, and in fact, when we do symposia, we all agree not to uh, convince each other. We're here to disagree. Let's defend that.
I like that. Well, I mean, I think with honesty comes openness, and when you you're just putting ideas into the ring to stand on their own or be defeated by better ideas, then I think it leads to a more open approach to everything. You're not being dogmatic. You're not committing your ego to something. You're there to learn. You're there to and it seems like that's been your approach in general and what you advocate. So I think that's really
I
fantastic.
won't say there's no ego involved,
Right, right.
but I do believe that winemakers You know, they're not in it for the money. The only thing they have is their honor, and they
Yeah.
have traded it away cheaply. And they
Yeah.
ought to just get over themselves and try to re-engage with the general public who is onto their game.
Yeah. I like that. I also, you being from Jersey reminds me of my friend who, when people ask him if he's from Jersey, he's like, "Yeah, you got a problem with that?"
Yeah, that's really how it is.
uh, they usually get to laugh. Well, thank you so much, Clark. This has been really, I mean, truly, I really appreciate your time. And I really appreciate you sharing so much of your expertise and just this entire, career's worth of, just what I mean, probably just a fraction of what you can talk about from a career's worth of learning and experimenting and becoming, better versed in winemaking. It's just been a real treat. Thank you for sharing it.
Well, I appreciate your helping me spread the news.
Okay. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And I just want to leave you with this thought, or these two thoughts. We will keep learning and changing until the day we die. And there are much more important things to our relationships with each other than whether we agree about some ideas. So have fun out there, enjoy, keep learning, and focus on the things that bring us together.